Thank you for attending this 30-minute webinar for Autodesk Fusion 360, brought to you by ThinkEDU. Fusion 360 combines industrial and mechanical design, simulation, collaboration, and machining in an integrated concept-to-production toolset. At the end of this short 30-minute webinar, you'll be given a link to complete an online evaluation. This is not a test, just a few questions asking your opinion about this webinar. Once you complete the evaluation, you will be emailed a $5 ThinkEDU e-gift certificate. You will also be automatically entered into our drawing for a brand new Microsoft Surface or MacBook laptop.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tom Tremblay. I'm with Concepts and Design. Today, we're going to take a look at the first part of a four-part series where we're going to be touching on a little bit different elements of Fusion 360, things that aren't typically being covered by a lot of other webinars that are out there, as well as some of the online training that's available. Today, we'll be starting out with sketches. I won't be doing a lot of sketching. There will be some files that are available to you after the fact to follow up with and experiment with yourself. But for this call, we won't be taking time to give hands-on time, as it will. So first off, let's take a look at the agenda. Let me make sure I can get my mouse moving here properly. There we are. We'll take a look at the Sketch tab, where the tools are. A lot of times we get busy with Fusion 360 and we start using it, and we don't necessarily take time to look around and see what some of the options are. Some things have changed just over the last few months. If you're new to Fusion 360, you might not be used to the idea that Fusion 360 gets updated sometimes in pretty big, awesome ways on a fairly regular basis, and gets updated in bug fixes and performance enhancements on an even more regular basis. For those of you that have been using Fusion 360 for a while, you're used to the idea, but it's very easy to miss some of the enhancements that come along. A key element inside of sketching that I rarely see covered in online classes is the sketch palette itself. It doesn't require a lot of attention, but there are some really neat capabilities, and there are some things that sometimes people new to Fusion 360 will be looking all over the place for certain settings that are just sitting right in the sketch palette. Another element of it that has been enhanced recently is some in-tool behavior. It's been around for a while, but it's, again, something that doesn't get covered very often. Then we'll talk a little bit about constraints, applying and removing constraints to a sketch, and what the values are. Oftentimes, this gets lumped in with dimensions. So I'm going to kind of separate those out, because constraints to me are really one of the more powerful things, and it's also one of the items that if you're not used to sketching in a parametric system or used to sketching with the concept of constraints, can be a little odd or a little tricky to get used to. But once you get the hang of it and discover just how important it is to the concept of parametric work, you'll see really how powerful it is. Then we'll take a look at some of the dimension options. The single dimension tool in the sketch environment has a lot of capabilities. And I also want to touch on named parameters. This is an element of sketching. It's also an element of modeling. It also has effects in assemblies. But it's a really powerful thing that can be addressed right away from the sketch environment. And of course, down at the bottom of the screen is the URL that will get you to the data sets for this session. This session is being recorded and will be posted, so you can always come back at a later time and give the hands-on a try yourself. All right, so let's get started with the Sketch tab itself. This is the key element for sketching tool access. It's customizable, at least the panel is customizable, and there are now the capability of customizing keyboard shortcuts. So let's just take a quick look at some of the things that I think are kind of interesting and often get lost. But before we do that, I want to start out, I've got a new project, and I'm going to upload the data sets. So if you download the data sets from the URL that was on the screen, you can, of course, use New Design from File, but I'm just going to select the files. There's only 3, And while we're talking about the toolbar here, let's go ahead and I'll just have those go ahead and upload. So the Sketch panel or the Sketch tab has a lot of capabilities built inside of it. Of course, there are a number of different rectangle tools, the circle tools, there are a broad variety. One thing I want to also point out is the fact that there are keyboard shortcuts assigned by default to many of the tools. However, just like the rest of the interface, which we'll take a look at some of the customization options of, you might not always use a center diameter circle. So you might prefer to use the 2-point circle. So one of the options that's available now, not just for sketching tools, but for all of them, is to go ahead and select the More option. It's going to argue with me a little bit. I'm sorry about that. And choose Change Keyboard Shortcut. This will bring up a dialog where you can add something like Shift-C as a keyboard shortcut just by pressing the Shift button, then the C key. You could also add additional keys. Now, if we go to the pull down, under Circle, you'll see that Shift-C is listed as a keyboard shortcut. Another very helpful way of customizing the interface of Fusion 360, and this is across all workspaces and across any type of tool, is that if there is a tool that's particularly useful to you, you can hover over the More tool again and pin it to the shortcuts, which is a S key menu, or pin it to the toolbar. This will allow you to just quickly access the tool from here. Now, if you ever decide that that customization is not something you want anymore, you can just grab the tool, come back, and deselect it. So just some quick customization. Now, some of the other tools and capabilities, as we get into things a little deeper, one of the things that often gets overlooked, now right now we don't have any sketch elements on the screen, so the tool isn't available, is another thing that new users of Fusion 360 frequently do is they get excited and they start sketching the shape that they want, but don't necessarily pay attention to the initial size. When you do this, you can go ahead and use these tools to scale the entire sketch down to the size or roughly the size that you want. It makes things much easier. Some other tools that you should look at are projection, the ability to bring in items, and even combine sketch items into one another. All of this is located in the sketch panel. Another thing that's important about the sketch panel is it exists in many other workspaces. If you're in the mesh workspace, if you're in Sculpt, you can still get to sketch. So keep an eye on sketch, get used to it, customize those tools as you like, and start building from there. So what I want to do now is I'm just going to open up a constraints drawing. And let's pop back over to my notes for a moment and talk a little bit about the sketch palette. The sketch palette automatically appears anytime you're creating or editing a sketch. It's really kind of the command center for sketches. So, of course, once you've started a sketch, you can use any of the sketch tools in the Sketch tab, but this is where the action is at as far as controlling the sketch. Not just applying constraints, but actually controlling the visibility and the options of a sketch. This is where the tool options will also appear while you're in a tool. Let's pop back and take a look at how that works. So, of course, here's a partial sketch in Fusion 360. Now, anytime I want to modify that, all I have to do is, of course, come down to the timeline, double-click, and I've activated my sketch. So let's take a look at the sketch palette. So there are a few items that appear, such as construction. What construction does is it allows you to take any entity in the sketch and tell it that it's not allowed or not recognized by a 3D functionality. So that if you wanted to draw a rectangle that conformed to the diameter of a series of circles, but you don't want to have to pick all those regions, you can simply tell the circles that they're construction geometry and they'll be ignored. We can turn the sketch grid on and off. We can engage snapping in the sketch. If you begin a sketch in the middle of a 3D model and want to edit it, it can be difficult because it's hard to see those sketch elements. You can engage Slice to cut away the 3D geometry that's between you and the sketch just by selecting this toggle. You can choose whether or not to show the profile. So for example, this is an enclosed profile, so Fusion 360 will automatically add some coloring to it to highlight it. The show profile will allow you to turn it off. You can show whether or not constraints are applied. Right now, there aren't constraints applied to this model, so they're not visible. And of course, you can engage a 3D sketch. This is a capability inside of Fusion 360 that if you need to create complex geometry, maybe a path for routing a hose or a pipe, what you can do is begin with a 2D sketch and use the Move tool to move elements of the sketch off of the original sketch plane, moving it positive or negative Z to that original sketch plane. In order to do that, you need to have 3D sketch switched on. Then, of course, we have all the constraints below that we'll use in the next section. So taking a look at a moment in the concept of creating constraints. And this is, as I mentioned in the introduction, this is one of the areas where people new to Fusion 360 can get a little hung up. It's a little different. But what I always recommend is just taking a step back and thinking about things from the geometry perspective. If you're creating something that's an L shape like is on the screen, and you want the sides to be vertical or perpendicular to one another, that's really all you need to know, is just think about how the geometry is going to relate to itself and to one another. Now, there are some additional capabilities, some additional sketching capabilities and constraints that can become more advanced. They can also help you get over some of the common problems, such as centering an object on another object without using a lot of construction lines. Of course, any constraint that's been applied can be removed and replaced with a different constraint. So even as you're sketching, when Fusion is trying to automatically apply constraints, you can go ahead and let those happen and always go back and switch them out. It's one of the keys to remaining quick and flexible in the tool is sometimes to let it go ahead and do its thing and then come back and make modifications after the fact. Let's take a look at some of these changes. For example, there are some constraints such as, well, maybe the relationship of this bottom left corner to the origin of the sketch. I could, of course, come over and use a coincident constraint, or in some cases, I can just grab the geometry and drag it, and it will develop that constraint. If I click on the point, you'll see that it shows me the relationship. One is the relationship between the origin and the point. The other, as I move to the right, and I turn the sketch grid off just for a little clarity here, you'll see how the two lines highlight. That is coincidence between those two lines. We'll see how to get rid of that coincidence or other constraints in just a moment. But for now, let's go ahead and use some other constraints. For example, I'll use the horizontal vertical constraint to set the bottom line to be horizontal to the axis of the sketch. Then I can use tools like perpendicular to set that line to the left to be perpendicular, which of course is inherently vertical since the line it's perpendicular to is horizontal. We can use tools like parallel to build relationships between lines. Then of course tangency, we'll take our arc and we can see it's not quite lined up properly. It's a little short here and it's a little past tangency here. Well, with the tangent constraint, now it's collected. Now it's in place and it knows what it needs to do. Let's go back and apply a few more constraints, some vertical, horizontal. And now our sketch is largely constrained as far as its geometry behavior. If we grab one element, it will move. Now, if I decide, for example, I really didn't want this line to be horizontal, I'm not sure what angle I want it at now, but I know it's not horizontal. I can right-click on that symbol, which is the same symbol that's in the sketch panel, and simply select Delete from the marking menu. Now, if I grab the center of the line, it pretty much behaves the way it did, but if I grab either endpoint, you can see that that flexibility in the sketch is restored. Now, something people need to do, especially in a mechanical environment, is to be able to line objects directly. So there's a few different approaches. For example, if I wanted a 2-point rectangle in the sketch, and I want to align it to be centered horizontally or centered vertically to the line on the right, or centered to this line segment above. This is a great use for horizontal vertical. Now, as I move over this line, you'll see that no midpoint is presented. To get this to work, you have to hold Shift. This will present the midpoint. As a little tip, it will put these icons near their midpoints for the most part. Okay, and we'll come over here, find its midpoint. You see that it automatically detected what the closest relationship would be. However, let me undo that for a moment. Grab my rectangle and kind of change its position a little bit. Make it a little more of a challenge. So let's start horizontal vertical again. I'll hold Shift to pick my midpoint. And here, because of the proximity, it created a vertical relationship. So there are times where you're roughing in a sketch and you go to center something on another object and you get the perpendicular or wrong behavior. This is probably what's going on, is you were just a little too close to another option. Really simple. We have all the undos you could ever want inside of Fusion 360. So I'll take advantage of that. I'll just go ahead and kind of rough this back in where it was and quickly recreate that scenario, and then come back and grab the top again. So now this rectangle is centered. So now no matter how it moves, I'll hit Escape to get out of that tool, it's going to stay in that position. The same is true if these elements move. Now, one other thing I'd like to do is place an equal constraint between the end of this leg and the end of this leg, and now we've got more alignment and more control. Ultimately, the use of sketch constraints is about getting the geometry of the sketch to maintain the proper position and orientation to one another as you start to rough in the size, or as you start to make the appropriate changes to get the sketch to be the size that you need for the features that you need. Next, let's talk a little bit about dimensions. So dimensions are the next phase of controlling your sketch. So I like to approach things by making sure the geometry is moving right, and then make sure it's sized properly. And of course, there are exceptions, and a lot of people will work with a combination of things. It's not necessarily separate phases. But getting things roughed in and under control will make it much easier to refine the size. Sketching it initially in something close to the right size makes things a lot easier as well. But gesture-based placement, so if you're going to place a dimension on the sketch, depending on what you pick and how you move after you've picked it, you'll get different dimension options, and we'll take a look at that. Dimensions can be linked to one another to start getting their values to generate one another. So relationships and factors and formulas can be built into the dimensions. There are also some new right-click options, especially when working with forms like this one where there's a rounded edge. Previously in Fusion 360, we had to make up for some things with some construction geometry or do some calculation. And of course, any dimension can be deleted. Dimensions can also become driven so that they can reflect values, but not change the geometry. But that might be a little past where we're going to go today. So let's go back and take a look at our dimensions sketch. Again, I'll activate the sketch to modify it. And let's just take a look at a few of the dimension options. First, let's just talk about dimensioning in general. So we'll start the dimension tool. I'll use the marking menu to go down to the sketch tools and then move to the left for the sketch dimension tool. There's just one sketch dimension tool. So if I pick this radius and put a value in, or I pick this circle and go to put a value in, it automatically detects that one is a circle and that probably wants a diameter dimension, and one is a radius and probably wants, one is an arc and probably wants a radius dimension. However, when I go to dimension this circle, I can right click and choose that this should be a radius dimension. So even though I drew a circle for my multi-loop sketch, with which Fusion fully supports the ability to have multiple loops to construct things, I'll drop this in and set the value based on a radius. So it will do the calculation for me. It looks like I need to speed up a little bit here. Let me apply another dimension, this time by picking a line, and I'll right click and select the value to use the circle tangent arc. I'll be able to drop in my dimension, and it will update the size of the sketch. Still using the same dimension tool, drop in another quick radius. We'll update my model. I'll grab my line, and I could grab the edge of the circle to apply a dimension to the center, but instead I'm going to go ahead and select the center point itself, because I want to show you the gesture placement. So for example, if I move out to the left, I'm getting a vertical dimension. If I move above, I'll get a horizontal dimension. And if I move somewhere kind of in between, I can get an aligned dimension, all in the same function. I can also right click and force the issue if I want aligned vertical or horizontal. So here I'll push the value of vertical. I'll say that instead of just typing in a value, I want to make sure that that height is always this dimension, or is always 2/3 of this dimension. So I'll say times 0.66, and it will do the math for me, which is good because I'm not good at math. All right, next I want to do just a little bit of sketching, talk about a couple of other options. Let's go under, this is one of the tools that slipped in about a year ago or so. It's been very nice. Slots built into the sketch. So I'll do a center point slot, do a start point, an end point, and a radius for it. Okay? Now you'll notice that the center arc in the slot is already construction geometry, so it would be ignored for 3D. I'd like to go ahead and dimension this, and I can use the D key for dimension shortcut, and I can grab the two arcs and it will give me the difference between the two. So I'm not having to always use a radius or a diameter when it comes to things like arcs and this other geometry. Also, if you use the offset tool, drag out your offset value, and it will automatically place a dimension using that same approach that I used for this 12mm dimension. Okay? So one other thing I want to do is use a couple of more dimensions to locate this sketch. Let's build that off of the edge here, maybe apply a radius to the center itself. Now what I want to do is make sure that there's an angle value between the minimum value in this slot and the bottom edge. To do this, I'll go back and put in another line. I'll run it to the center point. Now this is something I don't want considered for 3D geometry. I'll select it and use that construction toggle I mentioned before. Now when I select the profile, you'll see it's a much larger profile. But I can use the dimension tool, select the first line, and get, of course, vertical, horizontal, aligned. But when I select the second line that isn't absolutely perfectly parallel, it automatically changes this dimension type to an angle. So, I must have over-refined my sketch. So it tells me that I've got to use an angle here. Let me see if I can break that loose. Now I've placed a driven dimension. I can right-click and say toggle driving. I must still have this locked in too well. Let me see if I can figure out what I've done here. Nope, that should be working. So let me try one more time. All right, there's an over constraint somewhere, and let me try that. There we go, finally. All right, so now I can establish that angle, and let's see if I can reestablish this dimension. Yeah, okay, so there's something hung up in here. I can work through it, but unfortunately we're getting short on time and I want to move on. But the ability for one dimension tool to apply all those different types of dimensions is a huge advantage, especially when you're first learning Fusion 360. Let's talk a little bit about named parameters. This kind of gets a little bit advanced, but it's something that I think even new users need to know about. Every time you create a dimension, whether it's while you're sketching or as you've been placing sketches deliberately, it creates a name. So there's a value like D1 is the 150 millimeter dimension you placed, D2. However, you can go back and rename those dimensions or create new custom names to drive dimensions ahead of time or in the middle of the entire process. The whole point is that these dimensions can have more the names can be more recognizable and a little easier to work with. They can still be linked and calculated off of one another. They don't change the way dimensions work in the sketch. However, they can add some significant power. And the named parameters can be updated either manually or automatically. So let's go ahead and take a look at how that looks. So I'm going to open the named parameters component. Now, of course, to modify this or to take a look at how this was defined, I'm going to double click on the sketch. And I see there's a series of dimensions, including one driven dimension here. So the length of this segment is just a result of any changes to any other segments. If I double click on a dimension and hover over it for a second, you'll see that instead of the typical D5 colon 190 millimeters, there's a seg2 length, so segment 2 length. To take a look at this in another way, I'll get out of the sketch and I'll go under Modify to Change Parameters. This is where I can see the current relationships and the current values, not just for the sketches, but for any of the parametric features, such as the rectangular pattern. So I have my lengths, I have my patterns, I have my offset from the end of where this hole is started from, and I can make modifications directly from this window. So if I go and make a modification of the dimension, it would update the model. However, I might want to build relationships or build information, more developed information. So instead of simply 144 millimeters, which is the distance between this first hole on the left and the second hole on the right, I might want to say that I want this value to be segment 2 length, and it is case sensitive, divided by 5. Okay, so that will now calculate out the value to be the segment 2 length divided by 5, but I'll say then take that value and multiply it times 4. When I press enter, it will update the value to 152. I'm going to go back in here and copy that, and I want the offset, so the distance between this edge and the center of the hole to be equal on each end. An easy way to do that is to use that same value and divide that by 2. When I say OK, the model updates. If I go back to the parameters table or even into the sketch, because as I said, the sketch doesn't actually change how it behaves, I'll say that I want that value to be 230 millimeters now. When I leave the sketch, you'll see that the holes are spaced out farther and kept up to date. So it's a really quick way to start building more complex and more powerful relationships directly into your sketch. Now, there are some additional resources available from Autodesk. There's great tutorials built into Fusion 360, as well as the Autodesk Design Academy. There's also a broad variety of online suppliers of learning content and Autodesk learning partners like myself.
Thank you for attending Part 1 of this Autodesk Fusion 360 webinar series. Please remember to complete the short online evaluation. Once you complete the evaluation, you will be emailed a $5 ThinkEDU e-gift certificate and be entered into our drawing for a brand new Microsoft Surface or MacBook laptop. Please visit thinkedu.com/evaluation. Again, that's thinkedu.com/evaluation. It will only take you a few minutes, and you will receive a $5 ThinkEDU e-gift certificate and be entered into our drawing for a brand new Microsoft Surface or MacBook laptop. Thank you.